Hello there. Now, being a writer who writes historical or historically themed novels, I do have a lot of research to do. And while it's not possible to get the historical background facts absolutely perfect, I do try to get a realistic feel of the period I'm writing in, as well as getting the descriptions, clothing, and everyday items as accurate as I possibly can. So how is this research done? Well, many writers do all their research before they actually begin writing the book. In fact, that's what I've always read is the correct thing to do. But you know what? Call me a rebel, but I've never been able to do that. Once I have an idea for a novel, I have to start writing it. I can't read a history book and not be inspired to start writing. It's just not the way I work. So my research gets fitted in around my writing. It's rather organic. I write, read, read. I'll read a chapter of a history textbook and then I'll do some writing. But while I'm writing, I'll usually need to stop and look something up. For example, when I was writing my historical novel, Isabel Bright, I had Isabel buy a new bonnet. Now, of course, as I was writing that, I had to stop and look up what a bonnet would look like in the year that she was buying it, so I could describe it. Of course, working in this way means that I have to go backwards and forwards. If I read an important or relevant bit of information about a time or place I've already written about earlier in the novel, I will go back to that part of the book and edit it. So it's kind of an organic process. I write the story in a linear fashion, but I'll return to bits I've already written to add a bit of information to give it more richness, or to perhaps change something I've got wrong. And this way of working just seems to work for me. Now, as for where I get the information, these are the main resources that I use. So firstly, books. Now, a book written by an expert using primary sources on a specific subject is usually the best form of research. In the novel I'm currently writing, which has as its base the history of the River Thames, of course I am using books specifically on that subject. So this book, Thames Sacred River, by the wonderful historical writer Peter Ackroyd, it's been absolutely invaluable. And also, there are certain books that can really help with specific things, such as clothing and household items. So, let's have a look. This book, which I picked up in a charity shop at some point, has been really helpful because it gives you pictures of each specific period. So that's really, really useful to look at when I want to describe what somebody's wearing. And or sort of everyday things, you know, that's sometimes can be really difficult when you're writing a historical novel and you just want to describe some everyday stuff. So it's books like this, History of Everyday Things in England, and this one is from 1066 to 1499. So I think, you know, and peruse charity shops and second-hand bookshops, you know, it's amazing what you can pick up. Now, books about what everyday life was like are also really useful. So for my London book, I have got Everyday Life in Medieval London, and for further back, Life in Roman London. That's a really good book. And also, what I find really useful are books that tell you what was happening in the country or the world in each year, because of course any historical novel is set against the backdrop or the political backdrop or social backdrop of the day. So books like this are really helpful. Let's have a look. So this is a bit of a weighty tome, Chronicle of Britain and Ireland. That has a year by year account with loads of pictures and articles. Very, very useful to say what was happening at a particular time. Also, my sister-in-law just gave me this recently. The Annals of London, a year-by-year record of 1,000 years of history. So books like that, really, really useful for knowing what's going on from day to day in history. Now, books are always going to be secondary sources, and any historian will tell you that the best historical research always uses primary sources. That is, sources that were created at the time that you're writing about. Now, this includes diaries, letters, or other written papers such as wills, deeds, maps, and various other documents. The diaries or letters of famous people have often been published, such as this book on the diaries of Fanny Kemble, the 19th century actress, which was useful when I was writing Isabel Bright, my fictional actress. But these kinds of documents can also be used for inspiration. When I was writing my Open University dissertation on local 19th century theatre, I used a bundle of letter held at Northamptonshire Record Office, written by members of the local travelling theatre circuit. I used my transcripts of these letters to develop some of the characters in that novel, Isabel Bright, and they were also useful to get an idea of the informal speech patterns that were reflected in the letters. But books are my main source of research, especially where they quote or reference primary sources, and most of these books do. But one of the disadvantages can be if I want to look up something very specific, and it can sometimes be difficult to try and find the exact page you need in the book. So in this case, I might then turn to the internet. So, of course, one of the advantages of using the internet is that you can search for something very specific. So one of the things that I looked for recently for my novel on the Thames is the building of the Tower of London. So let's have a look, see what comes up there. Now, the trouble is, while this can be useful, quite a lot of the time, let's have a look at that, what you'll come up with is something very basic. Okay. So that really doesn't give me the detail that I want. So it can take a while to find something that will give you the specific information you want. Wikipedia can be useful. I actually quite like it. I know it has a bit of a reputation for inaccuracies, but you can use it alongside books, you know, to double check things. And you can get quite a lot of quite detailed information there. And of course, it has useful images as well. But sometimes if you really want, you know, really good detailed books are better than the internet, or you might dig around for academic articles online, which sometimes you do have to pay for. I did find a very useful article recently on the Battle of London, which was a battle that happened during the Norman Conquest, when the Normans invaded London after they'd won the Battle of Hastings. But if I type in Battle of London, what you'll come up with is a load of Second World War stuff. So you have to be even more specific there. If I put in Battle of London 1066, Then there we go, the burning of Southwark. That's what we want. That's a Wikipedia article. So that's there's a more specialist sort of website that's, I think, is the actual article that I found that was actually very useful. So you can see, you might have to spend a little bit of time, but it can be useful. You can sometimes find things on the internet that you know, that just turn up and you didn't know about. So and it can be a little bit quicker than trying to find it in a book. Um, Our websites like British History Online can be very useful. In fact, this very morning, I was looking at some information about the St Mary Priory opposite Runnymede, across the river from Runnymede. And I found this on British History Online. And it actually gives me, it's also called Priory of Ankerwyck, that's next to the Ankerwyck tree, the old, very, very old tree, the oldest tree in Britain. And this actually gave me a little story in this little paragraph. There was a little story which I thought, I am going to use that for my novel. So that was very, very useful. So the internet can certainly be useful for little bits of information. If you can find the detailed information, it can come up with all sorts of things. What it can also be useful for is finding images. Now, of course, photography was only available from the 19th century, but you can find artists' impressions based on historical research. So for my Roman chapter, I was looking for sort of images of Rome and London. So if we go to images here, so you'll see there's various sort of artist impression models. That model is from the Museum of London, which is actually quite nice, and you can see that at the Museum of London as well. And there's little sort of things like this. So these sort of images are quite useful for when you're writing about a place in history, for seeing exactly, you know, what the layout was at the time. Now, one thing, of course, one has to be careful, and you'd have to know a little bit of history to start with. I see that this one has the Roman wall around the city. The period I'm writing about is actually at the founding of Londinium, and the Roman wall wasn't built then. It was built in about 200 AD. So you have to be careful. Make sure you're getting your period right, etc. That's a much earlier impression, based on archaeological evidence. So, there is, although, some of it is made up, it's based on historical research. So, you can get a good idea there of early Roman London. That's quite nice. Now, another thing I really like is using maps. Now, again, recently I was looking for what it might have looked like from the other side of the river when the Tower of London was being built. And first of all, with Google Maps, and of course you can find other maps as well, but Google Maps gives you a really good idea of what's around a place. So you can see, for other periods, it might be useful to know where Southwark Cathedral was, and various other places. But I wanted to know what it would have looked like standing across the river at the time that the Tower of London was being built. So for this, Street View was really useful. So You've probably used Street View. I don't need to explain how to use it. But if I move my little man over here, opposite the Tower of London, there we go. I can just move a bit closer. It's really, really interesting to see, you know, how today the Tower of London is absolutely dwarfed by these big modern 21st century buildings over there. Let's zoom in a little bit. You can see, so if you're standing on the edge of the river here, if you can imagine, sometimes when you're doing historical research, you have to use a lot of imagination. You imagine none of those buildings there, and mostly trees. It would still be very green. You might have seen a few church spires around, but the Tower of London would have stood out really starkly against that backdrop, and it would have looked extremely impressive. So that was really nice, useful thing to do, just to stand there. And of course, I can visit that place too, but while I'm writing it, before I get a chance to do that, it's very useful to use Street View and just get an idea of place like that. Of course, during lockdown, when I couldn't get to London, Street View was especially useful. But one of my favourite ways of doing research is to actually visit the place that I'm writing about. This might sound unnecessary for historical novels, given that places are likely to be very different from the same location in history. And the internet provides photos and useful things like Street View. But I find there is nothing like being in a place to get a feel for what it was like to actually be there, even if the time period is several hundred years ago. When I was writing my novel, Legacies, I took a lot of pictures around the graveyard of the church at Stratford to give me a feel for the place where I was setting a dramatic riverside scene. In more recent times, but before lockdown, I went to London to do research for my current novel, Dark River. And standing on Waterloo Bridge, I got a feel for the way the wind comes up the Thames from the east, so I could describe this when my protagonist was standing in the same place. I also went to the Thames around Cookham, and I found myself in an ancient woodland area on a hill, looking through trees down towards the river. Imagining this place without any houses or any buildings nearby, and the river a little wider, I was able to imagine the way it might have looked back in the time of the first settlers here. And when I visited the source of the Thames on a spring day in May, I remember very much the sound of birdsong all around, including a woodpecker. These are sounds that have been with us for thousands of years, so when I write about this place, this will definitely be part of the description. I like to get a feeling of a place, even if I'm writing about events that took place hundreds or even thousands of years ago. These little details that we may not even notice day to day really help to make descriptions in a novel come across as real and helps the reader to imagine themselves in the picture and how it felt to be there. And of course, while I'm in any area, any museum for the local area will be extremely useful. So for my Thames novel, I've visited the Museum of London, and I'll no doubt be making further visits there too. But finding a small museum in a place you're writing about is very useful, as you can see artefacts, local trades, and all kinds of things that might be useful to put into your book. Another thing I find useful for historical novel research are novels written in the period I'm writing about. Now, for one thing, you can get an idea of how people spoke. So if I'm writing in the 19th century, I'll usually read Charles Dickens. I find that the phraseology or patterns of speech of that era kind of enter my brain and come out when I'm writing dialogue. I used Dickens a lot when I was writing Isabel Bright. However, novels have only really been a thing since the 18th century, so finding the right speech patterns for earlier periods is a little more difficult. Letters and diaries can be useful, but most documents are usually too formal. Although things like wills and inventories can be useful for finding household items in use at the time. And as I transcribe wills as part of my job as a professional genealogist, then I have examples of those readily to hand. But even poetry or plays can be useful. And Shakespeare did write scenes in prose for characters who were commoners, and you can get a sense of certain words that were in common usage. And the same for writers such as Chaucer, and going even further back, the Anglo-Saxon Beowulf. These stories can give you a real flavour of what was important to people of the time. So, for example, in Beowulf, the values of courage and valour are very strong. So you see, there is a lot more to historical research than just reading. It does mean that it takes longer to write the book, but the more different kinds of research that can be done, the more the novel will feel real and will allow the reader to enter into the past with you. I hope you found this interesting, whether you are a writer or a reader who is just interested in how it's done. Please subscribe for more insights into the writing life and updates on my books. And if you have any questions, just write them in the comments and I'll be happy to address them in another video. Bye for now.